Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in Los Angeles, California. How's everybody doing today? I hope you're well, I hope you're happy, I hope you're healthy, and I hope you're staying safe. Stay home, stay safe. I hope you're enjoying the critter chats that we've been doing. We're on critter chat number 41, so that means I've been doing this now for 41 days, which is kind of amazing. It's gone by really fast. I hope you've enjoyed learning some few things about some of these many animals we've talked about. I've certainly learned a few things, and I've really enjoyed sharing them with you. I'm not saying this because it's ending. I'm saying it's because it's a milestone that we're over 40 days of critter chats now. It's going to continue as long as this isolation at home continues. If you've enjoyed Critter Chat and the other material I've been posting on the Zoo Nerd Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, please feel free to share, follow, subscribe with your family, friends, and anyone else who you think might be interested. Today's Critter Chat is going to talk about a very unusual animal. Most of us have heard of it, some of us have seen one, and we're all pretty familiar with the idea. But there's a few things you may not know or understand about porcupines. And that is the subject of our Critter Chat today. For starters, porcupines are rodents. They are in the rodent family. Or actually, it's a rodent order. It's much, much bigger than a family. Rodents are the number 2 order for number of species out of all the mammals. Any guesses what number 1 is? Bats. We'll be doing a bat episode later on. But today we're talking about porcupines. Porcupines are a rodent. They're one of the larger rodents. We have already talked about another large rodent in a different critter chat, and that was the beavers. So beavers, porcupines, they're not all that different, but yet they are. So one of the things that is common amongst all rodents is something to do with their teeth. Rodent teeth continue to grow throughout their life. And because of that, they spend a lot of time chewing to kind of sharpen those teeth. And also their teeth are a big part of how they get their food and sometimes how they make their home, like in the case of the beavers. But most rodents do a lot of chewing. If you've ever had a rodent as a pet, you know that that can sometimes be a challenge. They're very, very good at chewing their way through a lot of things. And if you let them run loose in your home, they sometimes can do a lot of damage to anything that is wood, sometimes electrical cables, sometimes plastics. So be cautious if you have a rodent as a pet at home. But rodents are a very diverse group of animals, but they do share some commonalities, one of which is those teeth that do a lot of gnawing. For porcupines and many of the other rodents, their teeth are sometimes very different colored than ours. Our teeth are white. A lot of animals also have similar white teeth covered with enamel. And rodent teeth tend to be more orange, yellow, or red. That's because they have a very high iron concentration in their teeth. It helps make their teeth very strong and helps protect their teeth as they're chewing on a lot of wood. For porcupines specifically, we'll focus now on them. There are 2 families of porcupines, and they kind of are separated geographically. Old World porcupines, so that's porcupines in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and New World porcupines, the porcupines in the Americas, North and South America. Between those 2 families of porcupines, there are a lot of species of porcupines. More than I expected, always the case it seems, as I start researching some of these topics. But there are a disputed number of species. Different places said different things. That's mostly because science is still figuring out, is this one and this one, are they a full separate species? Are they a subspecies of each other? That kind of thing. So that's usually why there are discrepancies. And sometimes the information that we have is a little outdated. It's a little old. Sometimes they found a new species since their website was updated, that kind of thing. but it is estimated that there are about 25 species of porcupines. I saw numbers as high as 29. I saw numbers around 23. It's somewhere in that range. So less than 30 as of now, according to science. But that could and probably will change. Some porcupines are pretty small. Some are pretty big, but none are huge. They're all like medium-sized animals and smaller. So out in a forest setting, which is where most porcupines live, it could be that there are species of porcupines we don't know enough about yet. So the old world porcupines and the new world porcupines, although they're both porcupines, there's kind of similarities to their family, but there's some differences between them. For one, where they live, right? The old world are in Europe, Asia, and Africa. New world are in the Americas. But they also spend different time doing different things. So the American species of porcupines typically are up in trees. They're really good at climbing. They have really sharp claws. They will spend most of their time up in a tree. That's where they go to if they're feeling threatened by something bigger that's maybe on the ground, like maybe a fox, a coyote, a wolf, a bear, any of those kind of things. Or if it's in southern South America, could be other jungle cats, those kind of things. So they also spend a lot of time up in trees because they eat trees. So they chew through the bark. They eat a lot of bark. And particularly for the North American porcupine, so that's the porcupine here in the United States and also throughout most of Canada and a little bit into Mexico. During the winter months, when there's not as much food available, they stay awake. They don't hibernate. So they rely almost entirely on tree bark during the winter time. Sometimes if you live in an area near a porcupine, that can cause a lot of problems for trees in your yard, or possibly even tools or other things made out of wood in and around your house. The other porcupines, the old world porcupines in Europe, Asia, and Africa, are more on the ground. They also tend to be a bit bigger, and they kind of be more black and white in color, where the New World ones tend to be more brown and grays. The Old World porcupines also, their spines kind of start in like a mohawk shape, kind of on their head and on the back of their head, their shoulders, and then go across the spine of their body and then flare out on their sides and the back of their body. The North American porcupine is very round in shape, whereas the African species and the Asian species tend to be more elongated, kind of with lots of spines. The Old World porcupines have really long spines, the longest of which can be up to 20 inches in length, so very, very big spines. Typically, porcupines in the Americas have much shorter spines, with the average spine being like 3 or 4 inches, compared to the 20-inch spines on some of the bigger species in Africa and Asia. The other thing that's kind of different between the two groups, the two families, the Old World porcupines tend to have multiple babies when they have babies, usually 2, 3, sometimes 4. So it's not huge. It's not like tons and tons of babies. But the New World ones tend to usually only have one. Twins is rare, but usually only one for the New World porcupines. When the babies are born, they are called a porcupette. They are born with quills, but their quills are very soft when they're born. So that's very good news for the porcupine mom. One, as she's giving birth, and two, as she's taking care of them for the next couple of weeks. Their spines do start to harden after about 4 or 5 days, and by the end of about a week or so, they are pretty pokey. Their spines, their quills, I'm going to use both the words interchangeably. So the word porcupine actually comes from a Latin word that porcu means pig, or porcu, or porcine. That means pig, and pine means spine. So when they named them, they thought they were spiny pigs. But of course, we now know they are not related to pigs at all. They are in the rodent family, but a spiny pig kind of is a good description for them, especially for the species that live in Africa and Asia and Europe. that tend to be ground dwelling and have burrows or use burrows of other animals and go underground, kind of like a pig might or does. All porcupines tend to be a little more nocturnal or nighttime dwelling. In a zoo setting, that always made it a little challenging because they would like to sleep during the middle of the day, which doesn't always make them the most exciting. So when I was a zookeeper and working with porcupines, we would try to do feedings, either first thing in the morning when we got there and they were still active and awake, or at the end of the day, right before we left to go home, because then they would have a little more focus and a little more attention, because that was the time they would like to be awake, instead of the middle of the day where they would rather be sleeping. So the largest porcupine is the North African crested porcupine. It can be about 3 feet long, 36 inches, and it can weigh about 75 pounds. So it is a very large rodent, but not the biggest. We'll get to that on another episode when we talk about capybara, which are the biggest rodents. But the North African porcupines are the biggest. They live throughout the northern parts of Africa, a little bit in the Middle East, and a little bit into Europe. Specifically in Italy, there are these porcupine species, which I thought was fascinating. I didn't know that was the kind of species that lived in Europe, so I was pretty excited to learn that. The smallest species of porcupine is a South American species called the Bahia hairy dwarf porcupine. They live in Brazil in the rainforest. They're only about 15 inches long, so just slightly longer than a foot. And they only weigh about 2.5 pounds, so they're pretty small. Some of the porcupines in South America also have a really remarkable ability with their tail. Some of them have really long tails, and they're able to hold on with their tails. So they could wrap around a branch and kind of help balance them while they're climbing in a tree, eating fruit, eating nuts, eating leaves, and chewing on the twigs and often the trees themselves. They can't really hang from their tail. It's not quite strong enough to do that like monkeys can or like an opossum can, but they can wrap that tail around, and it does definitely give them some support and some balance. I've seen them in a zoo setting, the prehensile tail porcupines. One thing I thought was interesting about all the porcupines, most of their quills, their spines, are hollow. And because of that, they are very buoyant in water. They're actually very good swimmers. And those quills or spines that are hollow kind of help float the rest of their mass. We've talked a little bit about what they eat, but specifically they are considered herbivores. They mostly eat plants. On rare occasions, they will eat something like a lizard or a small animal, but it's pretty rare that that would happen. They're going to stick to leaves, roots, fruits, nuts, twigs, and especially the guys here in the North America will eat the bark off of trees. So let's talk a little bit about our North American porcupine. If you've seen a porcupine in the wild in North America, it's all one species. So they live all the way across most of Canada, throughout the western United States, typically around the Rocky Mountain states, and a little bit down into Mexico. And then in the eastern part of the US, they live in kind of the Great Lakes states, so Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, a little bit through like Pennsylvania, New York, and then the New England states. So they're gone through most of the middle of the country and definitely the southern portion of the country. They are not found in those areas, but it's the same species across most of North America. They are called the North American porcupine, also sometimes called Canadian porcupines, because Canada really has them kind of all the way across their country, and there are a lot of them there. They are kind of grayish brown in color, sometimes even light colored, tan, kind of a yellowy color. And their quills or their spines are very dense. Of all porcupines, they have the most quills, with up to possibly 30,000 quills. Now let's talk about quills a little bit. Those are specialized hairs. Typically they attach to the porcupine's body just like your normal hair does, and then it gets a little thicker in the middle of the hair, And then at the end, it has like a little barb or like a little hook, kind of like a little fish hook at the very end. And it's very, very sharp at that point too. To the point that if you get a porcupine quill or spine in you, it is very difficult to get that out. For humans, it's a lot easier because we have fingers, we have thumbs, we can pull that out. We can use tools like tweezers. We can put things on it that will help numb the skin so it won't hurt as much as you pull them out. For other animals, specifically things like a dog, a fox, anything like that, it's going to hurt the animal quite a while and probably be a long time before it gets those quills or spines out of its face or its paw, wherever it gets them. Now, there's kind of a myth out there that porcupines can shoot their quills. That is not true. It is a myth. It is fake. For a quill to get stuck in you, you have to have contact with the quill. The porcupine can't launch them at you. So if you get a handful of quills from a porcupine, it's because you were too close to the animal and you were probably trying to touch it or something, and then it may have tried to hit you, it may have run into you, you may have run into it, you may have put your hand on it, but there has to be contact between you and the porcupine. Now, if the porcupine's dead and you touch it, you could still get the quills in you. So don't go touching porcupines. It can cause a lot of pain. For the North American ones, their spines or their quills are also very small. They don't look much different than like the regular hair that's kind of on their face or the other part. They kind of have quills all over most of their body, and they're vary between like 4 and 6 inches in length on most of them. So they're like this little poof ball as they walk around. Most porcupines can also kind of flare their quills out to make themselves look bigger. That's a good defense strategy if they're being chased or threatened by a predator that may want to try to eat them, like, or if it's even just an animal that sees them and is like, hey, what are you doing? Get out of here. Like a bear, maybe. The porcupine can flare up its quills and make itself look 2 or 3 times bigger. That's especially true of the crested porcupines, which are the main species that are in Africa and in parts of Western Asia, like from India over to the Middle East. They have the very big long quills. Those are pretty thick. They're almost as thick as like a plastic drinking straw, which I highly recommend you don't use because that's bad for the planet. But a drinking straw in thickness, they're very long and hollow. They kind of even feel like a little straw if you touch them. They can also shake those and make kind of a rattly sound, kind of like a rattlesnake. And then most porcupines have kind of a little tail that varies in size depending on the species. The ones who can curl their tail around, it would be different on them. Their tails are usually bare of quills. They just have little like furry hairs on them. But any of the ground-dwelling ones, and even the North American dwelling porcupine, has kind of a little paddle-shaped tail, so almost like a beaver, but much, much smaller. And it usually has some very sharp quills on it, and they can kind of hit things with their tail. And that's kind of a good defense for a porcupine if it's feeling threatened. It will flare up its quills first and say, like, back off. I'm bigger than you think. I'm more dangerous than you think. And then if, like, say it's a bear chasing a North American porcupine, porcupine flares up its quills, and the bear is still, like, getting closer and maybe sticking its nose near the porcupine can pop it on the face with its tail, and then the bear ends up with a face full of quills. Similarly, that happens to dogs quite often. If dogs are out in the forest or out in an area where they may encounter a porcupine, dogs get hit in the head by the porcupine's tail often. I saw a photo yesterday of a dog that had a whole face full of quills. It had been kind of missing from its home for about a week. They were all inflamed, starting to get infected. They had to take the dog to the vet. The vet had to put the dog under anesthesia and then carefully pull out the quills, put a lot of antibiotics on to kind of help heal the infection. It's a lengthy process. So if you have a dog, especially a big dog with a good nose, like say like a lab or any of the hunting dogs. Be very careful if you're ever in an area where there's forest and trees and possibly porcupines in the western United States in particular, because a porcupine can cause a lot of trouble to a dog and therefore the dog owner. A group of porcupines is called a family or a prickle. Isn't that a great name for a group of porcupines, a prickle of porcupines? I have seen a prickle of North American porcupines one time out in the wild in Utah. We were just driving through the mountains. We came around the bend. There was a nice little grassy slope and some trees up at the top, and there were 3 porcupines slowly walking up this hill that we saw them as we were driving around. We stopped and watched them for about 15 minutes. I really enjoyed seeing them. I have seen multiple North American porcupines out on their own. They tend to be solitary. I've seen them in Yellowstone National Park on several occasions. You can sometimes see them up in the tall trees. You'll just see this big like bump up in the tree, and if you watch and see it moving, or if you get binoculars and look closely, you can usually tell that it's a porcupine covered with those quills. Let's see if I need to cover anything else about that. Oh, one thing that I've learned today about porcupines that I thought was really interesting is that out in the wild they have this unusual craving for salt, and they're kind of always on the search for salts. Sometimes they find that in like a hillside or in a certain spot where salt may occur naturally. They'll dig that up, they'll chew on the salt, they'll consume the salt. Something about their body, they need more salt. Sometimes when they're around people, they find salt in some creative ways. They will sometimes chew on tools that people have used, because our skin always, if we sweat, it leaves salt on some of those tools. And they have noticed in places like in particularly like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan area, where there's like some camps or whatever, porcupines will often chew the wooden handle off of things like shovels or rakes to get to the salt. Now sometimes they have noticed, and they found this in some of the ground dwelling species over in Africa and Asia, that they will sometimes gather bones from big animals who have died. So like after the lions have eaten most of it, and then the hyenas, and then the vultures, and then whoever else, when there's just a pile of bones left, porcupines will sometimes take the bones and take it back to their burrow, and they'll save it for later, and they'll chew on the bones because they can get the salt out of bones from other animals. So porcupine burrows are often known to have bones stashed down inside. Now lots of things in Africa kind of use the same type of burrows, so it's sometimes tricky. I remember when I was there, we came across several burrows on a hike with a guide, and he pointed out one that was a hyena burrow because there were bones on the outside of the burrow. And he pointed out that most of these burrows are built by aardvarks, which are good-sized animals that weigh about 100 pounds. And hyenas will take those over, or porcupines sometimes move in. But the porcupines sometimes have bones hidden inside because they want to keep those safe for later. During my time in Africa, I did not see a porcupine, but I did hear them. At the one place we were staying, we kind of had this really amazing place. It was called Ilnagwesi. It's a conservation organization and lodge owned and operated by the Maasai tribe in northern Kenya. And they kind of build these big wooden decks, and then they put walls around 3 sides of it and a roof over the top. And then your bed is in there, and your bed also has mosquito netting around it, and your bed has wheels on the bottom, and at night they roll your bed out so you sleep under the stars with mosquito netting around to keep the bugs off, which is really amazing. It's a great place to go and visit. But underneath our deck where I stayed when I was there, we had a family of porcupines who lived. And so every night we would hear them as they would wake up and go out to go about their adventuring to go look for food. And we would hear them when they would come back in. We believe they had babies under there as well, because we would hear some squeaking And then when the parents returned, the squeaking increased. And so there was a lot of noise in the early morning hours. We talked to the people, to the Maasai tribe who owned the lodge, and we told them about the sounds we were hearing. They looked under there with a flashlight and they said, yes, you have porcupines under your deck. They won't bother you. It may just be some natural sounds at night, but it was pretty fun to hear their little sounds during the night and especially in the early morning. Now, during my time as a zookeeper at the Los Angeles Zoo, I was able to help take care of porcupines for a while, and they were an African species called the African crested porcupine. We had a male and a female. They were both around 2 years of age, and that is the perfect time for them to have babies. And during the time that I was taking care of them, they had babies. I saw the babies for the first time when they were 2 days old. They were little tiny, about this big. The parents are big. That's the picture I posted earlier today. The parents weighed about 30, 35 pounds. The parents were both still growing, so they would both still get bigger. The babies were about the size of a stick of butter when they were born. They are black and white. The babies had black and white on them when they were born. And their spines, you could see them just starting to develop, but they were soft to the touch in the beginning. By about the end of the first week, they had hardened up and were a little pokey on the edge. Baby porcupines are called porcupets, which I think is a cute word for them. They were really interesting to take care of. Like I said, they didn't like to do much during the middle of the day. The babies, especially early on, were very, very scared of us, even though we were taking care of the family. The parents got very defensive with the babies around, so we had to be very, very careful. As they got older, though, the babies became more aware of having us around, and they were starting to warm up to us a little bit more. The parents got to the point where they would come and take food from our hands, but because of their defensive behaviors and because of their big long spines, we usually did not go in directly with them. I was never their main keeper, so I was never supposed to go in with them directly unless it was an emergency. So I always worked through the barrier or through the fence with them. I do have some video of me feeding the dad porcupine. I'll try to post that up later on both Instagram and Facebook. But I really enjoyed working with the porcupines. People who have worked with porcupines long term say that they're very intelligent. They can learn very specific behaviors, like to follow a target, to step onto a scale. I know the main keeper at the Los Angeles Zoo was able to get them to do that. They are scale trained now to where they could step up onto the scale and get a good weight on them, so that's very good. A lot of zoos also will have porcupines as an ambassador animal because they're not overly dangerous nor overly big. They can usually train one to accept a harness and a leash so they can take it on walks around the zoo. I'll see if I can find a cute video of that as well to post later. Let's see what else. Oh, I wanted to talk a little bit about conservation and threats that porcupines face. So of the roughly 25 to 30 species of porcupines, we don't have a lot of data on some of them. So we don't know how many of each species are out there, but they are kind of assumed to be lower risk for being endangered, which is really great news. There are two exceptions to that. So there's a very small porcupine in Brazil that lives in a forest just on the edge of the country, where the country meets the Pacific Ocean, and that is called the dwarf porcupine. And it is listed as endangered because that forest is rapidly disappearing. Brazil has some very huge cities. Those cities keep getting bigger and bigger as more and more people keep living there. And so unfortunately, the dwarf porcupine in Brazil is listed as endangered, with habitat loss being its #1 threat. There's also a porcupine species in the Philippines that is called the Philippine porcupine. They got really creative with that name, but they are listed as vulnerable due to deforestation. So we talked about the Philippines a little bit earlier within the eagle species. We also talked about the Philippines a bit on the pig species, because there are a Philippine eagle and a Philippine pig species that are both very endangered, also because the forest is disappearing, so that impacts a lot of animals. I tried to find a conservation organization that specifically works with porcupines. I have not yet found one, but I will say this about conservation. So when you save something specific, if you save a habitat, if you put in a nature preserve in the mountains and save the whole tract of land because an endangered eagle lives there or these rare pigs live there, you don't just save the eagle and the pigs if you save the environment. You can save a lot of species that rely on the same space. And I think that is the biggest hope for the porcupines, is if they live in spaces where there are other animals being saved, that will benefit them as well. Specifically with the dwarf porcupine in Brazil, that forest where they live is also a forest where an endangered monkey lives, and because of that, that little forest patch is partially protected, and that will hopefully save those porcupine species. I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today about porcupines. They are a fascinating animal. They are very unusual. They cannot shoot their quills. You have to have direct contact to get the quills in you. It will hurt. Do not do it. It will be difficult to remove. It's not just simply pulling it out. It will kind of tear your skin open as you pull it out. I have not personally had them in. I have talked to people who have. So yeah, don't touch a porcupine. Even when we handled the little baby ones when they were brand new at the zoo, we wore gloves. So to protect our fingers. Big, strong leather gloves to protect yourself. So good advice, don't touch a porcupine. I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today. Feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and share. I'll be putting up more content about porcupines today on the Facebook profile, and I'll see if I can get a video on the Instagram. And as always, I upload these full videos on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook when Instagram cooperates. So we will see how that goes today. All right, until tomorrow, be safe, take care, have fun. See you later. Bye.